Welcome back. This is the Chapter 8 lecture recording. This one is a little bit different than the previous one because a lot of this chapter is terminology based, learning how we describe the acoustics of a room. We'll talk in general about how the acoustics are affected by general shape and size of a room, as well as the materials that it's made out of. But there is not really any simulations that I'm aware of that really capture this. So there are a bunch of YouTube videos that I typically use in class to illustrate some of this stuff, which just like on the previous chapters page, below the actual video that I'm recording now, I'll link to all of those. I would encourage you to actually look at the very first general room acoustics video before I move into talking about this, because it's only a couple of minutes and it kind of gets you in the right mind of where this is going. This chapter is dealing with acoustics in the sense of talking about reverb times, and reverb times all comes from reflected sound. So having a little bit of understanding of at least the first part before they start talking about treatments will help a lot. We will talk about treatments once we start getting into discussions of how we qualify the sound of a room, whether it's a live room, a dead room, something that is clear or not clear, whether there's texture. All these are terminology-based things that we will go through in this chapter. And it can get a little confusing because there will be some terms that will be very close in the way they line up, but they don't mean exactly the same thing. But you just have to kind of go over that and study it and figure it out, because that's the only way you can. So there's the short video, which I will probably label as general room acoustics. And then there's a series of 4 that are kind of walking through the same concepts in a little bit more detail. If you are interested, that you could also hit up probably before, but you don't necessarily even have to look at those. And then as we go through, when we start talking about some problems that you can run into acoustically, there are a handful more videos that you can look at. So ultimately, when we talk about the acoustics of a room, the important thing that we're going to be looking at is reverberation, which is the reflected sound that comes about in a room. So you can see up here in the corner, we have a sound source illustrated, and then we have a listener over here. And the sound that the source makes, the direct sound goes in a straight line from the source to the listener. And that's what the listener is going to hear first. But if the sound is generated in all directions, or almost all directions, there are a lot of different paths that the sound can take to reach them. Like this path here goes from the source, it bounces off this wall and then hits the listener. This one goes from the source, bounces off this wall, and then it gets to the listener. And so depending on what your source is, you could have millions of different paths for the sound to take. And it can take multiple bounces. If you look at this line here, it goes out, it hits one wall, it hits another wall, and then it comes in. So the combination of that direct sound and the reflected sound adds up to be what we all hear. Now, of course, the difference being the reflected sound takes a longer path, and all these paths are going to be slightly different. So the reflected sound gets there later than the direct sound. In addition, when the sound bounces off of a wall, some of it gets lost. Either it's absorbed by the surface, or depending on what you're doing within a treatment, it might just pass through. And what that means is if I have 100% of the loudness, same loudness, roughly at the same distance here, I might lose, say, 50% of the sound. And if it has a value in decibels of a certain value, it's going to be decreased in intensity by 50% or 3 decibels on this reflection, and gets to your listener a little bit softer than it would otherwise. So here's the direct sound intensity. Here is a reflected sound intensity, one that bounces only once. And then there's these several other ones that bounce only once. And then you start getting the multiple bounce ones. And as you add more and more bounces in, because of that absorption, when it hits the surface, you're going to get smaller and smaller and smaller intensities, coupled, of course, with the inverse square law. So what this means is you have a loud direct sound, and then all these additional reverberated sounds will get smaller and smaller in intensity as we go on in time. And eventually, you have so much absorption that you basically don't hear the sound anymore. So this alpha tells you basically the reflectance of the surface. If alpha was 1, then 100% of the intensity would be reflected. But if it's like 50%, only 50% of the intensity gets through. And in this case, what that means is if I look at the 2 sound case, here I have an intensity, I lose 50%. Here I have that same intensity, I lose another 50%. And what that would mean is I would go from 100% down to 25%, plus a little bit of wiggle from the inverse square law. So multiple reflections is going to deaden out the sound faster, assuming that your reflectance is not very high. If it's very close to 1, then there's almost no change in intensity. But if it's really small, multiple bounces will deaden that sound out really quick. So this first graph that I was talking about, that would be like if someone clapped in a room and you're hearing all the kind of reflected sound that comes off after clap. This one is a sustained tone. So it would be like a speaker outputting a certain intensity. It gets out, here's where you have the direct sound, and this is where the reflections start to come in. And at some point you level off at an intensity. And then when you let it go, that's going to fall off quickly. And what we're going to be interested in defining for a room is this time that it takes to go from a certain intensity down to 60 decibels below that. And that will define what we call the reverberation time of the room. So here we have a bunch of math. Also, there's a little bit of math on this page. You don't really need to be that concerned with this. The idea is more important, that as we have a reflection, we're losing some of that sound energy. It's either absorbed by the wall or it passes through, which I think is described in that kind of set of 4 videos a little bit better. So what we care about is how many bounces are going to happen. And we have a way of defining this, which depends on the speed of sound, that's the capital S, and the dimension of the room. Now, the typical dimension is kind of hard to define. It depends on the shape of the room. In a typical square type room, it would be like, what is the width of your room? What is the height of your room? What is the length of your room? Those would all give you a certain number of bounces between walls as you go from one side to the other, bouncing back and forth. And that doesn't even include diagonal bounces and all that. So if I have a certain amount of time that I'm interested in and a certain dimension times the speed of sound, that tells me how many bounces occur in a given time. So say a second. Pardon me. The intensity, then, if I have in 1 second 50 bounces, the intensity is going to drop by that alpha to the power of 50. Now, we'll see in the next slides that come up, this dimension, we can define it roughly as the ratio of the volume to the surface area. And I'll talk more about that in the next slide. So the reverberation time, as we said, is the time that it takes for the sound level to drop by 60 decibels. Again, don't worry so much about the equation. Just know what the reverb time means and what factors into it. So reverb time has the dimension component. It also has the speed of sound. So if that changes, that's going to change your reverb time, which means when the temperatures are different, your reverb times are also slightly different. It has the room dimension, which is the volume to surface area ratio. And then we have our reflectivity of the surface as well. Sorry again. So as we're looking at this, speed of sound, if it's faster, our reverb time will go down because S goes up. So that makes your reverb time shorter. Alpha, if alpha goes down, then, sorry, I said if speed of sound goes up, reverb time goes down. If your alpha goes up, your reverb time also goes down. And the D is going to be the thing that most directly influences this. So when we are looking at the D, we want to take the volume to surface area ratio as it says down here. So if you have a room that has a volume of 10 cubic meters, which is enormous, and the surface area is 10 meters squared, then that ratio 10 over 10 would give me a roughly 10 meter kind of characteristic dimension. What this means is we can look at the influence of our volume or surface area, trying to keep all these other things constant, but it's really this ratio that determines it. So if you could somehow keep the same surface area in a room, but increase the volume of the room, that would make the D larger and it would increase your reverb time. Correspondingly, if you could keep the volume constant somehow, but change the surface area, that would, say, increasing the surface area here with the same volume would give me a smaller D and give me a smaller reverb time. So there are a couple of questions in the homework that ask what happens if you change the volume or what happens if you change the surface area. This is considering keeping the other variable constant. So larger volume for the same surface area, larger reverb time. Smaller volume for the same surface area gives you a smaller reverb time. The larger surface area for the same volume gives me a shorter reverb time, and a smaller surface area for the same volume gives me a longer reverb time. That's a lot of words, but hopefully that makes some sense. So the absorption, as we mentioned, is also going to affect the reverb time. A lot of times in a room, you don't have just one surface material. And so you'll have one wall that's made of drywall and say some windows and maybe some curtains. And all of those things are all going to have their own individual alpha. Well, sorry, these are the absorption coefficients, not the reflectivities. They're all going to have their individual alpha, which gives us an absorption coefficient for that particular material. And in addition, the material's absorption kind of depends on what the frequency of the sound is as well. So if we want to get the total absorption in the room, we want to look at not only the absorption coefficient, which is 1 minus that alpha. So if you have something that is highly reflective, like concrete is highly reflective, then this A is going to be very small. And so what this means is even if you have an enormous concrete wall, because that absorption is small, it doesn't contribute a whole lot to the total absorption by the room surfaces. Whereas if you have something that's uh, very absorptive, like an acoustic board, that type of thing is going to have a very large A, and the large A times a certain area will give a corresponding high amount of absorption. So if you want to get the absorption for the total room, you've got to figure out, well, how much is concrete, how much is acoustic board, how much is glass, how much is wood, all that stuff, and add up all that absorption. So then if we want to find the reverb time, we have the speed of sound still. We have this constant that comes about from the equation on the previous slide. Volume of the room and the absorption of the room. So the absorption has the surface area encapsulated in it. It looks like this is surface area, but this is actually speed of sound. This has the area in it, but it's modified by what is the absorption of that particular surface. So in the sense of, if you keep the same surface area and the same volume, so you have a room that's got bad acoustics, it's got a really large reverb time, and we can't rebuild our room. We can't change the volume. We can't change the speed of sound. We can't change the area. We can change the reverb time by increasing the absorption of those surfaces by treating them with something that absorbs a lot. That would increase the absorption down here and change the reverb time. So this slide just shows that when we look at different materials, you can see that the absorption is going to change. So these are not the alphas, these are the actual A's from the previous slide. So concrete is very low absorption pretty much across the whole sound spectrum. Acoustic board is fairly absorptive at, well, not really that absorptive at low frequency, but as you get into the mid and high frequencies, it absorbs almost everything. Drywall, which is what a lot of stuff is made of, gives you a little bit of absorption in the low end, not that much at the high end. Glass is absorptive at the low end, not that much at the high end. And a lot of this has to do with just how the materials move. These are hard-ish materials, but when you push them with a low frequency sound, they actually have a bit of flex to them. They can respond to that. But high frequency sounds cannot actually push them around. Carpet and curtains are used for treatment to bring down the brilliance of the room because they absorb high frequencies, but they don't really affect the low frequencies. So different materials are used in different situations to try to kind of, if you have a certain range where you're having problems, you can treat with something that only absorbs in that region of the spectrum to kind of just identify that particular problem and narrow it down. So the ideal reverb time is very different depending on what you're trying to do. For lecturing and conference rooms, we want very short reverb times so that the reflected sounds of someone talking don't overwrite what they're saying. You basically just want to hear only direct sound when you're talking about a lecture. We don't go with complete zero reverb times a lot of times because we're used to hearing some reverb, but not, we just don't want it to be overbearing in a situation where you're talking. Recording studios are also often pretty low in reverb time because if you do want to put reverb in your music, it's very easy to add that in with some sort of effect after the fact, a spring reverb or a plate reverb or something like that. Music reproduction rooms, these are like listening rooms. These have a little bit longer reverb time, but again, we are not making it crazy because we do want to preserve the sounds that you are trying to listen to. And then you can see for different eras of music, there are different kind of corresponding reverb times that are ideal. And that just has to do with the nature of the rooms that the music was composed for. So chamber music was played in certain rooms. They had characteristic reverb times. And so there are going to be better sounding in rooms that match these reverb times rather than something like romantic music, which is rather slow. The notes flow from one into the other very well. So long reverb times are nice there. Shorter reverb times for chamber music, there's a lot of distinction in the notes. It's very percussive to the playing, and so you kind of don't want the reverb from the previous notes to kind of overwrite the definition that you have in the music. So there's different ideal time periods, and if you're building a general purpose performance space like the Meyerson or something like that, what you typically do is have treatments that you can move around so you can alter the reverb time of the place where of the actual performance space. So if you need a longer reverb time, you can drop curtains down to absorb to absorb less. You can pick those up to allow for more reverb time. And if you need shorter reverb times, you can increase your absorption with the treatments that you can put away at other times. So the next section is going to be very terminology based, where we're just saying how would we describe a room. And we will start with talking about liveness. So liveness has to deal with whether your reverb time is long or short. If you have a very long reverb time, the room is live. It means you have a lot of reflected sound in the room that's going to contribute a lot to the actual sound of the room. And a shorter reverb time would be said to be dead because all you would really hear is the direct sound and not much else after that. A perfectly dead room would be outside with no reflecting surfaces. So if you're out in the middle of a field, there's no reflected sound, and so the reverb time would be exactly 0. This is also sometimes called an anechoic environment without echoes. There are anechoic chambers as well, which in a lot of cases for testing certain things, people will put things in an anechoic chamber just to see how it performs in a situation where you have no echoes. Intimacy is how close the performers seem to be. So visually, clearly, if you're in a small room, you're very close to the performers. You're going to hear the direct sound. And in a small room, that first reflected sound is going to happen really quickly because sound moves really fast. And if you're in a small room, it's going to bounce off of a wall and make it to you not long after the direct sound. So in intimacy, the time delay between the direct sound and the first reverb determines the effective intimacy of the room. If you have a really short time delay, so it's you hear the initial sound and then you hear the reflected sound right after, that's an intimate room. If you have your direct sound and then a really long lag before you start picking up the reflected sound, that would be a not intimate room. The good thing is intimacy is something we like, and it can be simulated by reflecting that sound from the performers that would go away from you. So in the Meyerson or some room like that, they can put reflectors back behind the performers so that the sound that would go to the back of the stage gets reflected forward. And then you have a really short lag time between the direct sound and that first reflected sound because it's coming only a few feet from behind the performers. And so you can make a really enormous room sound a lot smaller by putting those reflectors back behind the musicians. And the other benefit is that increases the volume of sound because you're getting some sound that comes in directly after. It's going to increase the total intensity of the sound. If you remember back on the first slide, they have the direct sound graph on this side of the page where you had a spike and then you start picking up more and then the sound level leveled off. The reflectors would be the ones that give you that next boost after the initial sound comes in. So another term is fullness and clarity. Fullness is sound that has a lot of reflected sound. So slow music is going to prefer fullness because there is a lot of reflected sound. So you're talking romantic music with long reverb times. That prefers a room that has a full sound where there's a lot of reflected sound. Clarity implies very little reflected sound, so speech, because you're talking and you don't want the reflections to overwrite what you're saying next. You want to have a lot of clarity in that space. And fast music also, where you're moving from one note to the next really quickly. These require a lot of clarity so that you can understand what is actually being said or played. And these two are the inverse of one another. If a room has a lot of clarity, it's not going to sound full. If the room sounds full, it's not going to have a lot of clarity. And so what this means is a room that prefers that you would play romantic music in is not going to be good for giving a speech because there's a lot of reflection and you're going to lose the clarity, and vice versa. What this means is, of course, is if you're trying to build a general purpose space, you have to be able to mess with the reverb time somehow, or just kind of pick something in the middle and have it be a jack of all trades that's not really ideal for either situation. But as I mentioned, a lot of performance spaces that play a wide range of music in an orchestral sense will have the ability to tweak the reverb time to the music with treatments that are installed inside the performance space. So one thing, since fullness has a lot of reflected sound, it's almost synonymous with liveness. It doesn't mean the exact same thing, but a room that sounds full and live will be almost the exact same thing. Because if there is a long reverb time, that means the reflected sound is fairly present. And so thus the room would also be one that would be said to sound full. Warmth and brilliance are kind of where the range of sound, what part is enhanced. So when your room sounds warm, the reflected sounds that have a longer reverb time, that stick around longer, are going to be your low frequency sounds. So you have a lot of fullness in your bass end, a lot of clarity in your treble end, and mid-range can lie kind of in between. If you have a room that's said to sound really brilliant, there would be a lot of high frequencies instead of low frequencies. It would be said to sound kind of a tinny type sound, like a really small speaker sounds tinny because it only really produces high frequency sounds well. And a room that is brilliant, a lot of times what you have there is a room that is made with a lot of really hard materials. And because we tend to hear high frequencies better, even if the wall is reflecting almost everything equally well, because we hear those high frequencies fairly well, we would tend to overhear the high frequency sounds. So soft wall materials will automatically give warmth. They tend to absorb the high end. Hard wall materials give brilliance. You can go back to that table before we got into the terminology and see Soft wall materials, the curtain, the acoustic tile, absorbed well at the high frequency and didn't absorb well at the low frequency. So that's going to give you the warmth that we're talking about. And the hard wall materials, most of them had a high frequency that was really low, and the low frequency might have been a little bit higher. But if you're talking concrete or brick, that was pretty uniform all the way across. And so the brilliance there just comes in from the fact that we hear higher frequency sounds better than we hear low frequency sounds. But something like drywall has a higher absorption at the low end and a lower absorption at the high end. And so it's naturally going to lend brilliance to the room. This is why in a lot of performance spaces, small venue performance spaces, you'll see curtains on the walls and things like that, so that you cut the reflected sound in the high end so it doesn't sound overly harsh. Now, texture is how the sound decays. Texture is interesting because if you have a room with poor texture, what this means is you have very distinct echoes. So ideally, you get your sound, you cut it off, and you have a nice smooth decay from loud to soft without any real artifacts in the sound. It just goes, it gets quieter and quieter. If you have a room with bad texture, what you'll have is, instead of this nice kind of, actually, let me pull up the annotate. So a good texture situation would be something that kind of just decays naturally like that. If you have distinct echoes, what you would end up seeing is something where you'd have some decay and then it spikes up and then you start to decay again and it spikes up and you start to decay again, where each of these is a very distinct echo that's coming in. And so what we want to do when we design a space is we want it to do this. We want it to go from high to low really nicely. But if you build a room that's, say, got nice parallel walls where sound can bounce back and forth between them, what you might end up with is a situation where it starts to decay and then you get that big strong echo, and then it starts to decay and you get a big strong echo, and so on and so on. So this type of situation where we have a nice smooth decay, that's good texture. Something where we have distinct echoes that pop in, this is poor texture. So how do we get this? Well, we want to have a lot of irregular reflecting surfaces, and we can also add treatments that absorb and diffuse the sound, like in the very first video that I showed you. One of the videos later on, that when we talk about flutter echoes, which is something that would give us poor texture in a room, it's someone popping a balloon in a lecture room, and you can hear all these distinct echoes that come about after the pop of the balloon before they treat it. Without seeing the room, I can't tell you what they added, but they probably added some absorbers and diffusers on the side of the room so that instead of the sound bouncing back and forth between walls, it hits the wall and either gets absorbed or scattered away in a different direction. So it would come like, pull that back up. It would come, instead of bouncing back and forth between walls, if you have parallel walls, if I put a diffuser here, the sound comes in and it would bounce maybe this way instead. And so now by making it reflect in a different direction, it's going to hit a wall over here, and then it's going to bounce over here and bounce around. And it would hit, instead of just one surface that may be hard, it'll hit multiple times before it gets back to the listener, which is going to give us a nicer, nice smooth texture to the decay of the sound, instead of something where the sound kind of sticks together and you hear it bam, bam, bam every time it gets to the center. So blend and ensemble are very similar terms that have to do with uh, what either the listener is hearing or what the performer is hearing. So blend is uniformity of the sound by the listeners. So if you have a room with good blend, you can sit anywhere in the room, and you could hear all sections of the stage very well. Now, what if you're talking about something like the Meyerson? This would be you hear the violin section and the cello section and all the horns equally well, no matter where you are in the audience. If the room has bad blend, then what would happen is if you're sitting on one side of the room, maybe you can't hear the horns very well. You're sitting on another side of the room, you don't hear the violins very well. And other sections will be predominantly loud. And this is something that, it's not ideal, clearly. So the way you typically fix this is by reflecting the sound from the stage and kind of making sure that it's uniformly directed everywhere so that you kind of balance everything out. Ensemble is how it sounds from the perspective of the performers, because if you have a stage that's really large, you have one person at the very far end of the stage over here and one person at the very far end of the stage over here. It takes time for the sound to get from one side to the other, and in that time makes it difficult for the orchestra to keep time with one another. It's part of why there's a conductor as well. But the conductor is only going to do so much. They operate a lot based on the hearing. So what you have to have is your reflectors that you put behind the stage for intimacy can't direct the sound in one particular direction. We don't want sound to bounce from here and here directly. We want the sound that travels from here to hit this and kind of spread out everywhere. So everyone on this side of the stage is hearing the same thing from over here, as opposed to only one cello member sitting over here being able to hear this violin player. So one thing this actually does is it limits the size of the stage that you can actually perform on, because you can only keep that ensemble to keep everyone together by keeping the sides of the stage limited. Now, when we get into amplified sound, we kind of throw all this out the door because we've got speakers everywhere and we can control the sound a lot more directly. A lot of this stuff we were talking about is for acoustic rooms. Something like the Meyerson probably does have some amplified sound as well, but it's predominantly going to be the acoustics of the room that determine the sound there. So amplified sound, we want to keep all the features that we previously discussed, whether you're inside or outside. We want it to be intimate. We want the texture to be good. We want the blend to be good. Liveness or clarity depends on what you're actually amplifying. So on that side, if you've ever seen or heard videos of people speaking in like a big stadium, big football stadium, and they're giving a speech, you'll often hear them kind of stumble around, sounding a little bit like they're drunk. And the reason for that is the clarity of that area is so bad because the PA is so delayed from what they're saying. They hear themselves in the PA after they speak, and it really confuses their brain. They're trying to sync up what they're saying with what they're hearing, but it's not possible to do it because of the size of the venue and how the sound has to be delivered to the actual stadium. In a music sense, you can stagger speakers throughout the audience, And if you do that, you have to delay when the sound is being played. So if your speaker at the stage is playing sound at one time, a speaker 100 feet from the stage needs to be delayed slightly so that the sound that's coming out of this speaker 100 feet from the stage is the same as the sound that is actually coming from the stage. So you don't have kind of a clashing of those two sounds arriving at the audience. You can then place speakers facing back toward the stage to give you some reverb, intimacy, warmth, texture, all that, because you control what is playing out of those speakers. You can control when the sound comes out. And so you can, if you're outside, mimic the effect of what you would have if you were indoors. Now, focusing of sound can be an issue. If you have a room that's got parabolic or spherical surfaces for walls or ceilings, then you can get spots in the crowd where the sound is going to sound louder than others. So what this, of course, means is that the blend is not good. Domed ceilings will do this. So underneath the dome, you'll have a spot typically where the sound is reflected from the dome and focused. And if you're standing there, it sounds different than if you're elsewhere in the room. Rooms that have a curved back wall. So if there's a room and the back wall is curved like this, there will be spots in front of that curved wall where the sound will be focused. And there's two videos that will demonstrate this. I'm going to talk about the whispering chamber effect in a sec. So there's one that shows the whispering gallery in Grand Central Terminal in New York, where you can stand in different corners of the room and the sound that is that's made by the person over here. So if someone is talking here, it reflects off of the ceiling and walls and comes over to the opposite corner. And so you can talk really quietly in the corner over here and talk to a friend over here. And that's utilizing the focusing for kind of a beneficial effect. Most of the time, that's not going to be beneficial, though, and you want to try to avoid it. There's also another video which has a kind of lecture room. That will probably be the last one on the page. And this one shows a room that's got a big kind of back wall that's curved, and you can hear a lot of focused sound back at the stage because the sound is hitting this curved surface and it's coming back to the stage as an echo, especially since the back wall of the chamber is flat. And so you have this focused sound hitting a flat wall and it's bouncing back here and it's getting reflected. And so it ends up sounding really not good. And then in the video, it's a company that does treatments and they actually treat the room. And afterwards, the reverb time is killed substantially, and also that echoing effect is out the window. So if we want to avoid focusing of the sound, what we would do is, first of all, avoid kind of this parabolic shape to begin with. We can increase the absorption or the diffusion on that back wall so sound is not being reflected into a single point. Or we can use really gently curving walls. We don't want something with a sharp curvature that has a nice space. I mean, something that is close to flat, but not perfectly flat, because having flat walls has its own effect. So the whispering chamber effect is one where someone standing in one part of the room can effectively communicate with another person in another part of the room because of that focused sound. And again, I would point you to that video of a person singing in Grand Central Terminal in New York City for understanding that. There might be other examples, but that's the one that I have. Echoes and shadows are two separate things, of course. Echoes are formed by highly reflective flat or parabolic wall shapes. So curved walls can lessen the effect. And when they say curved here, they don't mean curved this way. They mean more curved kind of outward. So you're diffusing the sound. Or curved walls. Yeah, outward slope, outward curving. Flutter echoes happen when you have parallel walls. So if I have two walls, not stop share, pull this guy up again. So if I have two walls that are perfectly parallel, sound here is going to bounce back and forth between these parallel walls for a long time. And you're going to hear the sound, and here it's going to be, if you're the listener here, as that sound bounces back and forth, every time it gets to you, it's going to be really loud, and then it's going to taper off and then be loud. And so this happens fairly quickly depending on the size of the room, because the time it takes to travel from here and back really depends on what's my dimension here. So there are ways we can do this. We can do kind of some kind of curvature to this, or even just a kind of slanted line. So these walls are narrower here and broader there. Will keep the sound from directly reflecting. If the sound comes and it hits this this line here, it's going to bounce this way instead of straight back. So what we want to do to clear out our echoes is basically just make walls that are not parallel or walls that are not parabolic to begin with. Shadows happen when we have projections out over the audience. So in a concert hall, if you've got a balcony and it comes way out over the audience, people that are sitting well back behind the front surface of the balcony are going to get diffracted sound that's going to cause dead spots in the audience. So what you typically do in an auditorium is you limit how far the balcony juts out, and or you just don't put seats too far back in behind the balcony so that you're not seeing these acoustic shadows. It's pretty easy to note when you see balconies in really nice performance spaces. They are pretty much limited to only a few rows back underneath the balcony, because sending the seats too far back there, you get these shadows where you have the sound quieted and also the mix changes, and so it's not a good listening space anymore. Resonances happen also when you have parallel walls in a room. And so what you end up with for resonances are standing waves. So if for a specific speed of sound, you have the dimension just so for certain frequencies, you'll set up a standing wave. And so you'll have spots where the sound will be really loud. If someone is sitting at the antinode, it sounds really loud. If they're sitting at the node, they can't hear it at all. And these resonances, you're going to have one set for each direction. So one for the length of my room, one for the width of my room, one for the height of my room. But then I also have one that's for the diagonal corresponding to the length and the width of the room. And then one for the length and the height, one for the width and the height, and then all three. And so there's an enormous number of resonant frequencies that you get these resonances. And what you can do to eliminate this is make the room so that it's not rectangular. So a typical room, we're kind of square. That's a really bad square. But if I give this a little shape, now instead of these walls being rectangular, I don't get those surfaces. This is greatly exaggerated. typically you don't need to make it very large, just need a little bit of variation from parallel to break up these resonances so you don't get standing waves forming in your room. And a lot of recording studios will have this kind of just not quite parallel wall so that they don't get any weird resonances in the room. I've included a video in the page where you actually see someone scanning through their room space. They're changing the frequency output by a speaker and then recording what they hear with a microphone. And at certain frequencies, you will see the see the loudness spike. Those are resonances of the room that they're picking up. So maybe one for the length, one for the width. And you can see how something that's nice and perfectly rectangular, it's very easy to get these standing waves set up. We also have to worry about external noise, so outdoor traffic noise, air conditioners. These all would kind of destroy the ideal sound for a performance space. So most of your high-end performance spaces have a box within a box construction. Also, recording studios will do this. So there's an outer wall, and then there's a little bit of a gap and an inner wall, or in the case of like the Meyerson, a big gap because there's a lobby and there's a bunch of airspace surrounding the actual performance space. And the air insulates and helps shield the actual performance hall from the outside sounds. So what this means is if you have practice rooms and concert halls that are right next to one another, you need to insulate them from one another somehow, or you're going to get bleed over between the two spaces. And then outside, you have to shield from external noise. If you're out in the middle of the field and there's a road nearby, you're not going to be able to eliminate the traffic noise. But if you put the performance space in a valley like Red Rocks in Colorado, well, also that's kind of out in the middle of nowhere where there's not a lot of traffic. But being in the valley, it's surrounded by basically shielding, and so external noise is not really all that prominent. So the next few slides are a particular performance space that they mention in the textbook in this chapter. It's at a college, and I can't remember what college it is. So here you can see, here's the stage. This is choir pit. Back here, these are where the reflectors would be. They can sometimes be removed if you don't want to reflect that much sound for the piece. And you've got your areas of the stage. Up here, there's not really any curved walls. There's a little curvature here, but if you notice, these spaces are actually curved outward, so they're diffusing the sound that there as well. Maybe we'll get a better view of that in a second. But there's also it looks like some sort of treatment on these parallel spaces so that they don't get those flutter echoes. Also, some of that perspective is just the lens they're using to take this picture. So here's the stage with some risers on there. It's the same space. You can see all the reflecting treatments here. Reflecting treatments. Some curved space so that the sound is diffused. You can see back behind here the space where the reflectors could be if they wanted it. For our balcony, we've only got like 2 or 3 rows of seats that actually sit under the balcony so that we don't have significant sound echoes, or sorry, not echoes, sound shadows in this room. These are just barely under the balcony, so they're not really diminished in any way. This back surface also, there are some curves, but there's some break up to the curves. You can see this kind of transition here. There's probably one here as well. I can't really tell. where these are not going to have the exact same curvature all the way across. And so we don't have something that's nice and reflecting. We've got the reflections from this not giving us really any focusing of sound. And then up here in the rafters, they have removable curtains that they can use to tune the reverb time of the room. So if they need that extra absorption to increase the clarity of the room, they can drop these down. If they need a longer reverb time, they can retract them. And a lot of performance spaces will have these types of movable treatments. I'm pretty sure a place like the Meyerson does. And I know that something like the American Airlines Center, which is predominantly a sports arena, definitely has these treatments to try to improve the experience when you're playing a concert in there, though it's still not really a great performance space at all. But it's an attempt to try to mitigate some of the issues that you get by trying to use a sports arena as a performance space. So a few conceptual questions. I'll go through these, give you probably maybe 15, 20 seconds to think about it and then explain what's going on. So the reverberation time is measured in a concrete room, and then we line it with carpet, and we want to know whether the reverb time increases or decreases. So think about what you have learned, and of course here the answer is that the reverb time will okay, sorry, just playing games. The reverb time is going to decrease, or sorry, yeah, it's going to decrease here because we're going to increase the absorption in the room. So reverb time has absorption in the denominator, and increasing that absorption is going to lower my reverb time. If the volume of the room is decreased by adding another wall, will the reverb time increase or decrease? So in this case, the surface area and the absorption is fairly uniform. You would lose a little bit of surface area, but the volume to surface area ratio is going to change. So given that statement, think about it for a sec. And now, again, if we think volume in the numerator, absorption in the denominator, which is tied to the surface area. So if I decrease V but keep A almost the same, then my reverb time is going to decrease. And essentially what's happening is you're getting more reflections in the same amount of time, and so more sound is being absorbed. If we have two rooms that are the same volume, they have the same material, but they are different shapes, will the reverb time be the same in both rooms? So again, think about what we know about volume and absorption. So absorption factors in the surface area. So volume over the absorption, which is tied to the surface area. The room that has the higher surface area is going to give you the shorter reverb time. So V is the same for both rooms. And in the denominator, if your absorption number is larger, that gives you a shorter reverb time. So in this case, the room with the bigger surface area is going to have the shorter reverb time comparatively. So they use specifically a sphere versus a cube. A sphere has a surface area of 4 pi r squared, and a cube would have a surface area of 6s squared, so whatever the side length is. So assuming that the radius and the side length are the same, 4 pi is about 12, and cube having 6, a sphere would have a bigger surface area, and so it would have a bigger absorption, and then thus a shorter reverb time. If two rooms are the same shape but have different volumes, which will have the lowest resonant frequency? This one's a little bit trickier, but in this case, same shape means, say they're rectangular. Volume is going to depend on the size of the room. So a bigger volume room is going to have longer dimensions across it. And if you remember the resonant frequencies, those are determined by the actual dimension and its inverse to that. So if I have my dimension in the denominator, a bigger room is going to have a lower resonant frequency. So smaller rooms are going to have higher resonant frequencies. Larger rooms will have lower resonant frequencies. Last one, if we fill a room with water, what happens to the resonant frequencies? That's essentially what it's asking. So water has a much higher speed of sound. That's what you need to know to answer this question. So again, dealing with resonant frequencies, the speed of sound is a direct factor. The higher the speed of sound, the higher the resonant frequency will be. So if we filled a room with water, those resonant frequencies would be increased by a fair amount because water has a much higher speed of sound. And the last one, in order to have a room resonance, does there need to be a harmonic present in all three dimensions? And I think I discussed this when we talked about resonances. So you could just go back and listen to that part or think about it. And for this case, the answer is no. It doesn't have to be in all three dimensions. We could have one across the length of the room, or across the height of the room, or across the width of the room, or on any of the diagonals, or any weird multiple diagonal that we want to create. In any case, you can have resonances from many different directions. And what this means is it's very complicated to actually define all the resonances that you pick up in a very rectangular room. And so that is the end of chapter 8. Again, I would encourage you to look at some of the video resources that I have there. This chapter is pretty much terminology based and understanding what happens to the reverb time. Those are the two big things that you should try to take out of this. Understanding how the reverb time is affected by volume and or the absorbance of the room, which again factors in the surface area, and then just what the quality of a room is. What does it have to be a live room versus a dead room? What does it have to be a clear room versus a full room, and so on and so on. So yeah, this one, once I have the test 2 study guide up, I think this material is covered on this test. So that will help for sure. I'll probably be publishing that sometime this week, just so you're aware. And again, if you're having trouble with these, let me know, and we will try to work it out. And we'll move on to the next one soon. All right. Have a good day.